If you love water sports, it's quite important to know about tides, especially in the Hunstanton area where the difference between high and low tide can be pretty big. This difference between high and low tide is called the tidal range. Without knowing about tides, you might not even make it into Brancaster Beach. Getting your tides wrong might simply result in a frustratingly long walk. For example, one day you could visit Heacham and the sea be a short walk from the car park. The next time you might turn up and it's a very, very long way away. On a big low tide at Hunstanton itself, the channel might be only waist deep in the middle, great for learning or trying new tricks, as you can simply stand up after a failed attempt. On the other hand, at high tide, you could have no beach to land on at all, and some very dangerous groins and concrete walls to negotiate. Of course, it's not just the tide moving in and out. The change in depth of water can conceal underwater obstacles. At the south end of Old Hunstanton Beach, for example, these posts come into play at certain states of the tide. If you ever visit a beach you don't know, it's always a good idea to ask a local about stuff like this. Or alternatively, next time there's a big low tide, have a good look around yourself. So, why do tides happen? How can we plan for them, and how can we use them to our advantage? The answer to why can be incredibly complex and fascinating if you want it to be, but here's a basic introduction. The Earth's surface is around 70% water, but to make explaining simpler, let's just imagine it's all water for now. This water is subject to gravitational forces from both the moon and the sun, with the pull of the moon being the dominant force as it's so much closer. These forces can cause the water to bulge away from the Earth's surface. For example, let's say it's a full moon, which occurs when the Earth is piggy in the middle between sun and moon, and everything's in line. Now imagine we're looking down on the North Pole and this white dot is the UK. Over the course of 24 hours, the Earth will do a full anti-clockwise rotation, and the dot will move from one bulge, high tide, to a low tide approximately 6 hours later, to another high tide, to another low tide. If this was all there was to it, then high tide would be the same time every day, exactly 6 hours after low tide, and to the same height. What happens in reality is more complicated. Some of you will have noticed that on some days the tidal range is huge, whereas roughly a week later the tide barely moves at all. You also might have noticed that if high tide today is 10 AM, tomorrow it will be more like 11 AM. So, what's going on here? Well, to put it simply, everything is moving. The sun, the earth, the moon. If we imagine looking down from above, the earth is not only rotating on its own axis anti-clockwise, but also orbiting the sun in the same direction. Meanwhile, the moon is orbiting the earth anti-clockwise, while both of them travel together around the sun. The moon takes roughly 28 days to orbit the Earth and looks different to us depending on where it is in its lunar month.
When you are the moon, the best for you can be is a full moon, and then a half moon is alright, but the full moon is the famous moon, and like 3/4, no one gives a shit about him. When does he come? 2 days into the calendar month? He's useless. full moon, the moon, the main moon.
Like we said earlier, a full moon is when the Earth is piggy in the middle and sunlight is fully illuminating the whole of the moon. The gravitational forces are all in a line here, so the bulges are bigger and we get a very high tide and a very low tide. Such tides are called spring tides, although this is nothing to do with the season. Roughly 7 days later, and from the UK, the moon is only half lit, showing only its left-hand side. Sun, Earth and Moon are at right angles now, and although there is a bulge, it's not quite so pronounced. As a result, you still get a high tide and a low tide, but there's not so much of a range. Only a medium-sized high tide and a medium-sized low tide. These are called neap tides. Roughly 7 days later, and the moon now looks in complete shadow, which we call a new moon. Again, Sun, Earth and Moon are all in line, so we once again get big gravitational forces, big bulges, spring tides. Move approximately 7 days on, and this time only the right-hand half of the moon is lit. Earth, Sun and Moon are at right angles once again, small bulges, neap tides. Of course, the Earth is not 100% water, and the shape of the land below the water's surface has a massive effect on tidal range. In some parts of the globe, tidal movements are barely noticeable. Parts of the Mediterranean and Caribbean, for example, some only have one high tide a day. All of these types of differences can be explained by how the large ocean feeds the water into all the little nooks and crannies of the coastline, with all its varying underwater slopes, gullies, shelves and channels. Around Hunstanton, as a general rule, the tide floods in from the North Sea and splits off east towards Brancaster and south towards Heacham. This produces tidal currents which run parallel to the coastline. If you ever want to check this, just go on a windless day and float a board in the water and see which way it goes. For example, this footage is on an incoming tide at Hunstanton. And this is the same day about 20 minutes later at Brancaster. Conversely, on an outgoing tide, the current tracks north from Heacham and west from Brancaster. These currents have a significant effect on wind sports depending on the wind direction. If the conditions are wind with tide, for example a southwesterly at Hunstanton on an outgoing tide, or a northerly at Hunstanton on an incoming tide, then you will typically find it harder to stay upwind and the water state will flatten off. Conversely, a southwesterly at Hunstanton on an incoming tide, or a northerly on an outgoing tide will be wind against tide, and you'll find it easier to stay upwind. You'll feel a lot more powered up than the wind speed would predict, and the water state will be a bit more choppy. For kite surfers in particular, it's extremely useful to know which way the current is flowing, as if you lose your board, it will generally go with the current rather than the wind. I mean, it depends on the board. For example, large directionals like surfboards have more windage and will blow downwind. However, a typical twin tip will track with the current even if it means it's moving upwind. Currents can also sometimes curve round obstacles such as sandbars, and there's a few other exceptions as well. However, if you want to be sure on any particular day, at the start of your session, just take half a minute and chuck your board away from you and watch which way it goes. These currents also have a big effect on stand-up paddleboarders and canoeists. For example, on a windless day on an incoming tide, you might find it a doddle to paddle down to the fair from the sailing club, but have to work a lot harder on the way back. These tidal currents vary in strength depending on the state of the tide. Typically, they're at their most powerful a couple of hours either side of mid-tide, and obviously much more powerful when it's a large spring tide than a neap. Conversely, the 2 hours either side of high tide or low tide see the currents at their weakest, and these periods are sometimes referred to as slack water. So, whether you can access the beach, how far it is to walk to the water, whether or not underwater obstacles come into play, the effects of tidal currents. All these are useful things to know if you love to party with Mother Nature out on the sea. So how do you find out tidal information for the Hunstanton area? Well, you could buy a set of tide tables from a local shop. These will list not only all the low and high tide times, but also the expected heights, usually in meters. Alternatively, there's lots of online resources. In fact, if you go on the Sailing Club website weather page, here, you'll find not only a daily update on tide times and heights, but also a live wind speed reading and a link to the club's live webcam feed. Of course, the heights in meters are only meant to be guides. The wind strength and direction on that particular day will also massively affect how high the tide is. For example, if high tide at Hunstanton is predicted to be around 7 meters, you can guarantee that the access road at Brancaster will flood. However, if there's a hoolie blowing from the north and it's only, say, a 6.3 metre tide at Honey, there's still a decent chance that the northerly wind will help push the tide further in and flood the road. Similarly, you might be looking forward to a nice shallow session at Hunstanton, with low tide predicted as a mere 0.5 metres. But in a strong westerly wind, you may find that the tide is held in place and doesn't go out anything like that shallow. Well, I hope you found at least some of this basic introduction useful, but if you'd like to go into a bit more detail, please check out some of the links listed in the text below this video.